I don't know how much influence the Koch brothers have over decisions made in Ottawa. I don't know how much influence Imperial Oil and Exxon have. But what we're dealing with right now is governmental decisions that are taken in an irresponsible and reckless fashion, ignoring both the economic interests of Canada, the environmental interests of Canada, and the long-term ethical and moral obligation we have to ensure that we don't shoot past 2 degrees Celsius.
What do you love most about this area of the country?
There's a tremendous amount of citizen activism here. If you are looking for climate action and people who are totally committed to climate action, you'll find it in Saanich Gulf Islands. There's so many different projects. Here on Salt Spring, for example, the students at the high school, Gulf Islands Secondary School, raised the money to put solar panels on the roof of the school. I mean, this is a province where most of our electricity is from hydroelectric power, so it's not coal-based. But they just decided it really mattered to be generating solar as much as possible, and they've created solar scholarships. So all the money that's saved by not buying power from BC Hydro goes into scholarships for students here. Salt Spring Island, just look around, you'll see that there are more electric vehicles here per capita than anywhere you're going to see in Canada. People are really committed to reducing their carbon footprint as much as they can.
Can we have a strong economy that doesn't revolve around fossil fuel production?
Absolutely. We can't have a strong economy that does revolve around fossil fuels. I mean, fossil fuels, in purely economic terms, we're seeing it now from the International Energy Agency and other financial analysts, is basically a huge pile of stranded assets. Our former governor of the Bank of Canada, who's now the governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, talks about the carbon bubble. I mean, we have financial and economic experts saying, hang on, having fossil fuels that are unburnable is going to undermine your whole economy. You've got to shift off carbon as fast as possible, remove all the subsidies, and put proper pricing in place. So the economy of the future is without a doubt going to be a post-carbon economy.
When we go through this kind of transition that you're speaking of, we would have to inevitably start to bolster our economy with clean energy.
Right.
What would that do in terms of job creation and retention of jobs?
It'll create a lot more jobs, and particularly for Canada, the place where we can create the most jobs the fastest and get the best bang for buck is in dealing with the fact that our entire economy is inefficient. We can improve energy productivity by 4 or 5 factors without even really having to break into a sweat, because we still waste more than half the energy we use. We need an army of carpenters and electricians and contractors and skilled trades, because 30% of the greenhouse gases in Canada come from leaky buildings, where we're wasting money heating the outdoors in the winter, cooling the outdoors in the summer. And this has been decades now that people have talked about this as the low-hanging fruit. Well, the low-hanging fruit's gotten so low, we're stomping all over it. We're ignoring major opportunities to kickstart our economy, put people to work, reduce greenhouse gases, and do it in ways that are neither high-tech, we don't have to wait for anything new to be invented. And while we do that, and we're seeing the price of photovoltaic dropping like a stone, which is great news, because in many parts of the world now, for the first time ever, installed solar capacity over its lifetime is going to cost less than installed coal capacity over its lifetime, if it's new coal. You look at that, you think, this is a formula for a transition of our economy. So why isn't it happening? It's happening because many democratic governments around the world have become captured by corporate interests and counter to their national economic interests, counter to their national interests in job creation, and certainly counter to their environmental interests. They are beholden to large corporate interests, such as in the oil sands. These are large corporations that have cultivated governments that are more supine than is healthy in a democracy. I worked in the office of the Federal Minister of Environment in the 1980s, and in June 1988, Canada hosted the first comprehensive scientific international conference on climate change anywhere in the world. It was opened by the Prime Minister of Norway, Gro Harlem Brundtland, and the Prime Minister of Canada, at the time Brian Mulroney, and it was co-sponsored by the Government of Canada, the United Nations Environment Program, and the World Meteorological Organization. Nobody suggested in the 80s that there was any doubt about climate science. Climate doubt was invented after the Rio Earth Summit in '92. The world's big fossil fuel monoliths decided to start throwing millions of dollars in lying to people and telling them climate change wasn't real. In the same way that cigarette companies spent millions of dollars to convince people that smoking cigarettes wouldn't cause lung cancer. It's the same tactic, it's the same strategy, and it's often some of the same very people. So when Stephen Harper formed government in 2006, he took office at a point where Canada was bound by a legally binding treaty, the Kyoto Protocol, to reduce our emissions substantially. There was a plan in place that would have gotten us very close to our Kyoto target, and it was funded with $6 billion. Stephen Harper, without a single vote in the House of Commons, canceled all those plans within weeks of when he took office. He had his environment minister go to the first international conference in Bonn in spring of 2006 and announced that Canada no longer felt bound to live up to the target for which we had signed and ratified a treaty. It's been shocking, thing after thing, without proper reporting in this country, without Canadians having any real sense of the accumulated horror of what has happened since Stephen Harper formed government. First canceling the plan, then pulling us out of Kyoto as a legally binding instrument, making up new targets, which were all much weaker than Kyoto, and then never reaching them, going into major new investments in oil sands, defending oil sands against all comers, promoting pipelines, promoting tankers, and at the same time, killing programs such as incentives to buy hybrid vehicles, killing the program that allowed Canadians to get a tax rebate if they made their house more energy efficient. I mean, there's just a litany of things.
Could we talk a little bit about like Bill C-38, Bill C-45, just to give people a little bit of an idea of how that kind of came through the legislation as well?
Yeah, well, the first piece of legislation that is at least a bit relevant too is one I mentioned in the debates, Bill C-311. Now, this was back well before Stephen Harper had a majority. It was a private member's bill by my friend Bruce Heyer, who now sits a Green Party MP. It was a Kyoto Implementation Act. It was when Stephen Harper still only had a minority. So the opposition parties were able to get this bill passed for a Kyoto Implementation Act. And Stephen Harper instructed the senators, the conservative senators, to kill the bill without any study. By the time you talk about these omnibus bills, he started bringing in omnibus bills even when he still had a minority. But by the time he won a false majority, and I have to pause and say I call it a false majority because only 39% of Canadians voted for conservative candidates, but we have a very dysfunctional, perverse voting system. So a minority of the voters can elect a majority parliament in which Stephen Harper has a leadership style. It's not our system of government, but his style is to have one-man rule. So that's how he could kill so many things so fast. On C-38, it's relevant to climate, but only in part. It's an omnibus bill. If you go back to the Latin, it means basically an everything bill. And what it does is there's some omnibus bills that are legitimate, by the way, not to be too much of a stickler about this, but if you're making one public policy change, but it has an effect on a number of bills all at once, that's where omnibus bills used to come from. You change a few things in different laws because you had one big decision. What Harper has done is to basically, it's almost like a Republican thing from the US, where when they negotiate their budgets, they throw everything in. He's used the excuse of a budget to then throw in a bunch of things that have nothing to do with the budget. So the omnibus budget bill that you first mentioned, C-38, came in spring of 2012, was over 440 pages long. It changed over 70 different laws, not all of them environmental. It got rid of the Inspector General for CSIS, which is particularly relevant when we talk about C-51 in a minute. But anyway, C-38 eliminated the National Roundtable on Environment and Economy. I used to be vice chair of the National Roundtable. The work it was doing was hardly radical. It was a pretty small C conservative agency that did basic research and had prominent Canadians sit around a table and figure out how we can approach sustainable development. Well, it was advocating for carbon pricing, so it was killed in C-38. There was also another Kyoto Implementation Act. It was killed in C-38. The Fisheries Act was gutted, so we lost protection of fish habitat. The Environmental Assessment Act was repealed and replaced with a much weaker one. C-45, the following fall, removed more than 98% of all the rivers and waters and lakes of inland Canada from a piece of legislation that was initially passed when Sir John A. Macdonald was Prime Minister. It's called the Navigable Waters Protection Act. Then more recently, we C-51, which is a bill ostensibly to fight terrorism, but which will make us less protected from terrorist plots while at the same time eroding our civil liberties. And again, in the context of climate change, the connection with C-51 is that we already know the RCMP is monitoring environmental groups. It was found in memos that came through Access to Information that the RCMP, even before C-51, referred to climate activists as quote-unquote anti-petroleum ideologues, unquote, who claim that burning fossil fuels causes climate change. I asked on the floor of the House of Commons if we couldn't get a briefing for RCMP officers so they knew something about the science. I should mention that probably the worst thing Stephen Harper has done on the climate file is not just what he's done to Canada's commitment to meet our own domestic targets and our ability to do it, but in international negotiations where no one's watching anymore, no one's paying any attention. Canadian media don't bother to attend. None of the other opposition parties send anybody. So nobody's watching as Canada contributes to weakening agreements, blocking progress. We can get Canada back to being that country we once were, that's in the lead and saves treaties and pushes for more and gets the progress the world needs.
And past Stephen Harper, you're still going to have this conversation about pipelines. It seems like with the way that the legislation has been passed, it's essentially in order to enable
That's right.
this kind of infrastructure to come through. So why are pipelines such a dangerous thing? Some people will say, well, it's safer than a tanker car, like Lac Mégantic and things like that, but what's the risk?
The problem isn't pipelines. The problem is what's in them. Up until the 2008 financial collapse, Alberta was still planning on processing its own bitumen into synthetic crude with upgraders in northern Alberta. So after the 2008 financial collapse, those investments in upgraders disappeared. And even when the economic recovery began to kick into gear, they're realizing we're putting a lot of money into developing this huge open pit mines to develop bitumen. Bitumen, by the way, is a solid. They have to ship up to northern Alberta toxic material to stir into the bitumen called diluent. Then that can go in a pipeline. This whole scheme is about making sure that Canada has large volumes of exports of very low value product. Now you could have pipelines for high value product and they wouldn't pose the same risk at all. For one thing, bitumen mixed with diluent, we know from the Enbridge spill in the Kalamazoo River, simply cannot be cleaned up. Whereas a gasoline leak in a pipeline that's sending a finished product to market, if it has a leak, the material is refined, it volatilizes very quickly. It's a disaster, but short term, it doesn't stay in the environment very long. And the other thing, of course, if you're shipping finished product, you can't risk having any contaminants along the length of that pipeline, or your product is ruined from contamination. So there'd be cleaner pipelines, more quality control. In any case, Greens are not against all pipelines. We're against any pipeline which exists for the purpose of mixing bitumen with diluent and getting it to Tidewater to put it in tankers to send it to refineries in other countries. And of course, the climate piece to that is, as long as your model is high volume exports of low value product, then the money you're making is in expanding the volume of the high volume, low value. So the issue on the oil sands isn't whether we have to shut them down tomorrow or keep them going. The climate issue about the oil sands is primarily we can't allow them to continue to grow at this pace, to ship out raw bitumen to other countries. If we stop that rapid growth and bring back the idea of upgraders, then maybe also refineries closer to the source, then you're producing a product in Canada, not shipping it out on pipelines and tankers, and at the same time, you've reduced the increased constant growth of greenhouse gases by expanding how much you produce.
The consciousness of our world is changing. People are realizing, and as the frontline effects start to encroach on everyone's doorsteps, people are going to make the choice, whether it's 5 years from now or 100 years from now, to move past fossil fuels. You know, with so many other countries around the world working hard to create new technologies, new energy systems, what would happen if Canadians stick to the status quo as everyone else progresses?
Well, it's already happening. I mean, look at what happened with Stephen Harper putting all our eggs in the bitumen basket. Our economy is having problems right now because he skewed our economy. Around the year 2000, we were selling more value-added products. Now we're exporting more that's raw, unprocessed. So our economy is suffering because of a mania for making oil sands somehow important to our economy, which, by the way, they're not. The oil sands are 2% of our GDP. Tourism is 3% of our GDP. This is a mania for oil sands that can only be explained by excessive levels of corporate influence. So the good news is we've got time. The good news is we've got an election. The good news is we can go to Paris as the kind of country we used to be, and we can deliver on all these targets.
Well, Ms. May, thank you so much for your time, and we appreciate bringing this to the forefront of the conversation, because I think if it wasn't for you, we might not be talking about this as much on the federal level.
So. Well, I'm honored you would say that. Thanks, Ray. Thank you very much.